Everyone's been admitted, so I'm going to stop my screen share. And as soon as I stop that, you can start with the press conference.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. So you are muted. And once we start, we're going to ask you to turn off your cameras. And Monica and Brian will be, and I initially will be the only ones with our cameras on. Okay. So let's see, are we waiting for anyone else? Okay. Okay. All right. Are we ready? Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. I am Beverly Thompson, the Director of Public Affairs for the City of Durham. We've asked you here today to present to you a high-level briefing on the 911 calls for service study that is being conducted by RTI International. This information will be presented at the January 7th City Council work session. But we wanted you to have a chance to hear the information and to ask questions, because it is not a very straightforward kind of a session or data information that you would normally receive. So we wanted to present it to you in order to prevent and eliminate maybe some confusion about what the data actually represent. Monica Croskey Chaparro, is the lead for the City of Durham, and she will provide you some background information on this very groundbreaking study. She will be followed by Brian Aagaard of RTI International, who's conducting the study for us, and he will walk you through the data. Okay, and I'm going to turn it over to Monica.
Thank you, Beverly. My name is a mouthful even for me. So I'm going to really provide context to the project, and then I'm going to pass it over to Brian, who's going to share some of the initial data that we'll be sharing next week with City Council. So it's no secret, during 2020, we heard passionate pleas, emphatic demands for local governments across the country to really examine police operations within their jurisdictions. And local governments have responded in varying ways to reassure communities that they are committed to both ensuring the public safety, as well as doing that in a way that meets community expectations and community goals. Here in Durham, in late summer, our City Council asked our now retired city manager, Tom Bonfield, to have us look at police calls so that we could get a better understanding of the types of demand for police services. We have since taken that a step further, and we decided to invite experts over at RTI International Center for Policing, Science and Research to join us. And we also reached out to several of our peers in North and South Carolina, because we know all communities really are grappling with this challenge and this opportunity. So we really invited RTI and our peers to join us on this data-informed journey to really evaluate community demand for public safety, and then to explore whether there are opportunities to improve how we respond to those demands, those needs. So essentially, RTI is examining our 911 calls. They will also pull in other qualitative and quantitative data, but the project essentially has 4 phases. We're squarely in phase 1, which is gather and analyze data. And then following that phase, we will be researching alternative responses. The third step is to pilot alternative responses based on each community's data, the goals that their administration and their community might have, to really pilot alternatives that speak to those points. And then fourthly, and probably most importantly, having RTI do rapid evaluations so that we can learn more about the efficacy and effectiveness of those pilots. So although phase 1 is just squarely focus on data analysis. This is going to be an iterative and ongoing process throughout all the phases, and Brian's going to talk about that. And just two other quick things before I turn it over to Brian. I do want to underscore that for us, the Office of Performance and Innovation, the division I lead, we are leading this work. Durham Police Department, they're a very important stakeholder, but our organization thought it was prudent to have a third party lead the evaluation. The other cities that are participating are Raleigh, Cary, Burlington, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and Rock Hill in South Carolina. So now I will turn it over to Brian with RTI to have him highlight just a few of the data tables that we will be discussing next Thursday with City Council. So Brian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica. And I really appreciate it and having the opportunity to speak with you all ahead of the City Council presentation next week. I appreciate your time. So as Monica mentioned, RTI is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan, independent research institute. We're located just down 147 in Research Triangle Park. And we're really excited to be able to partner in this work with not only the cohort cities across the Carolinas, but specifically with Durham, who has really demonstrated tremendous thought leadership in producing a really thoughtful plan and a really carefully considered process for moving this forward. So I will now share some of the information that Monica was referencing. Give me one moment. All right, so we did an analysis of Durham's 911 call for service data that was focused on law enforcement responses. And why this is such an important data set is because it captures the universe of law enforcement activity in a community. And so the purpose of our initial analysis was to develop a common picture for what law enforcement is doing. And what's critical about the 911 call for service data is it clearly captures all of the information that comes in from the public who are requesting resources, but it also documents proactive activity that law enforcement are doing. Things like Directive Patrol, which would be someone requests that officers drive through their neighborhood, or traffic stops. Those are the types of things that are captured in this data set. And so starting with the universe of data and analyzing the complete set of information will allow folks to start asking and answering questions about what it is law enforcement are doing and what is the community demand for those resources. So as you can see in the first table here, we have call categories, and they're coded into 18 broader categories. So in most jurisdictions, and Durham is no different, there are literally hundreds of call nature codes. And an example of a call nature code could be something like a suspicious activity, or somebody that is requesting assistance due to a crime, such as they reported that their home is burglarized. All of those calls get a specific nature code so that they know, the officer that's responding knows what the incident is related to. So we coded, for the purposes of analysis and interpretation, we coded those specific categories into broader categories. So things like alarms, that would house the universe of alarms. So somebody's home alarm system goes off, it's subset in there. The important thing and the main takeaway from this analysis is that law enforcement are asked to do a wide variety of things, but you can see that the bulk of responses, over half, are related to Directive Patrol, which is a proactive activity that law enforcement elects to do rather than have a community call 911 for. And the other is general assistance, which is this catch-all category of numerous different types of call natures. And part of the presentation that we can share and that we will be presenting to City Council is all of the call natures that are grouped within these broader categories. They can be disaggregated so that we can drill into the data, and leaders at the city can be able to ask and answer questions with much greater specificity. So this is the second half of the first table, which shows all of the other types of calls. So you'll see that in progress violent crimes, that would be something like a bank robbery, for example, they comprise a very, very small subset of what law enforcement are doing day to day. And you can see mental health is another one that is an area there's quite a bit of focus on. And you can see here that that represents about 1% of all calls that Durham police have responded to. And this is an analysis of data for the past 3 years. So you can see there the second column there, the frequency, that is the overall count for the number of calls. So this analysis comprised just over 1 million calls for service that occurred over the course of the past 3 years. So going on and moving forward, one of the conversations that we've been having with city leaders is what are the outcomes of interest? What are the things that they're interested in understanding about? Once the types of calls and we understand the frequency and the prevalence of those, we need to understand how are those calls being handled? What is the outcome of those calls? So here, for example, we've broken down the universe of potential call outcomes into these 3 broader categories, which include no arrest, arrest, and then mental health referrals. You see a small subset there. Due to missingness in the data, we were unable to complete to analyze that. But you can see here the vast majority, just over 97%, result in no arrest. And you can see that mental health referrals comprise less than 1% of the outcomes for calls. The one thing that I want to emphasize here, and this is something that Monica already pointed out, is that these analyses represent initial findings of what will be an iterative process. As we continue to ask and answer questions, we're going to need to refine this analysis by pulling in adjacent data sets, things like criminal incident information from the record management system. Potentially, if there's interest in looking at outcomes like use of force or complaints, other data sets, administrative law enforcement data sets that include those data, that'll have to be included as well. But this is the initial scan to really level set and provide that common picture for stakeholders to understand what is it that police are doing currently and what is the demand from the community for those resources. And so again, to drill into the data just a little farther, this is an example of one of the tables that we'll be presenting next Thursday. And this shows, of those 18 nature codes that we grouped up, we showed the top 3 closed codes. And the closed codes show how those calls were handled. What was the outcome of that call? So you can see, for example, for a disturbance, you can see that just under 2/3 of all disturbances are resolved without a report. And that means that there's no further law enforcement documentation of what occurred on that. There's no criminal incident report, there were no arrests, there was no further activity. So you can see there that and just over 15% are resolved with an incident report. And that's the adjacent data set that I was alluding to. The incident reports, that's what you would commonly refer to as a police report. That's what's housed in the record management system. And that is another valuable and very data-rich data set that we'll be incorporating in subsequent analyses. And this is the other second half of table 6. And again, all of this information is available in a longer report that summarizes this and provides a little context. And that's a publicly available document. And then finally, the last table that we looked at, there's a tremendous amount of information in the call for service data set, one of which is time. So we know how much time officers are spending responding to these because we can see the point in time at which they were dispatched, which means the call goes out on the radio for an officer to go to do a certain activity. And then we also know when the officer is cleared from those calls, which says that they're available to take more calls and that they're no longer engaged in activity. So you can see here that the amount of time is similar in proportion to the frequency of the calls. You can see that around 30% of time, the universe of time that law enforcement in Durham in the past 3 years has spent on specific activities, 30% of that was allocated to general assistance and directive patrol. And we think understanding the amount of time that officers are spending on certain activities is just as critical as the frequency, because we understand that certain call natures take longer to evaluate and have a successful outcome than others. So I will now advance and stop sharing my screen. And with that, I think there's going to be time for questions. And Beverly, I'd like to turn it back over to you.
Unmute myself. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. All right. So I know you have questions, and I'm going to ask we follow this process. We have about 16 people on the call. And what I'm going to ask you to do is raise your virtual hand, if you can, unless I'm thinking of the wrong, if you can do that. And I will call on you and open your mic. And I'm going to ask you to state your name and then your question. Okay? So I'm not seeing any hands raised. Viv, can you tell what's going on?
So Beverly, I'm not sure I see how to raise my hand and
Oh, okay. I'm thinking of Teams. So, okay. I'm going to go to full view, gallery view. If you can state your name in chat and then let me know who you are. And I will unmute you. Okay, do we have any questions?
so Liz from WNC put in the chat that she has a question.
I don't know why. Okay, I see it now. Okay. Viv, can you unmute Liz? There she
I'm
is.
unmuted now.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I wanted to ask about what kinds of things fall into that general assistance category and whether that might have any implications for alternatives that might be on the table later.
Yeah. So that's a really astute question, Liz, and I anticipated that there were probably going to be some questions about the groupings. So this is the broadest category that we have. So this is everything from a missing and runaway person to litter. So there are, again, literally hundreds of call natures within the computer-aided dispatch system, and this is far and away the broadest. So I think in subsequent analyses there, and this is something that Durham has already requested, for all of the breakdown of frequencies that you saw for the 18 grouped nature codes, we're also giving them the information for each of the specific call codes down to, so there'll be literally hundreds of rows with counts of those sorts of things, because you're right. The next phase of this, and this is something that Monica alluded to in phase 2, the next phase of this is identifying potential alternatives to law enforcement response. And to do that, we're going to have a pretty granular understanding of what exactly and how common these things are and what exactly are the outcomes as they are currently. And Monica, if you think it's appropriate, either ahead of the city council meeting or during the city council meeting, we can provide a summary, an appendix that will show how all of these calls are grouped, if you think that's appropriate.
Okay. See if I can.
Thank you. I mean, no, I think that would be very helpful for folks to see how we have aggregated the calls. I'm sure that's going to be a question that council has as well. We can wait and I'll ask Beverly her thoughts. We can either wait until next Thursday or, but yes, I think being able to show how things are categorized, because Liz, I'm looking at general assistance and it's whole barking dog, attempt to locate, it's quite a bit. And that's the thing about data analysis. You want to be able to wrap your head around what you're seeing. So you want to do groupings, but then as you start to ask questions, sometimes you need to decompact all of what you grouped. So very much an iterative process, but I think it would be helpful for everyone to see the chart. And it's really simple. So I think it would be helpful. We can PDF it and maybe even add it as a amendment. I got to learn our processes more, but we'll be sure to make it public so folks can see.
Yeah, and so Liz, I want to make sure that you had your question answered there. Was there a specific type of intervention that you were curious about and that you were wondering about the call natures?
Okay, I unmuted you, Liz. Okay.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to get a better sense of what the range of possible alternative interventions might be. I know that that might be a step ahead in this process, but just to have some sort of a sense of what we might be talking about or what might be considered later.
Monica, I'll defer to you, but just initially, Liz, I think it's a great question and a great observation. And what Durham has emphasized to us is that we need to be thinking broadly and comprehensively about this. We can't jump to conclusions and say that there's just a certain subset of calls that we need to re-examine the law enforcement response to. Starting at step 1 means that we're considering the entire suite of things that law enforcement will be asked to do. And then from there, moving forward, look at interventions that may be able to both interventions and existing city resources that may be better at responding to those types of things. And then in the absence of an evidence base for those interventions, that's why the rapid testing and the rapid evaluation that we're going to be doing. So this takes months and not years, so that we can identify promising practices both in Durham and across the cohort cities that can be scaled up, knowing that they're having some level of efficacy early on. Because a lot of these interventions represent a tremendous investment for the cities and the communities, and we want to make sure that we're getting these right.
And just to add on that, I see Judith has a question, but to build on that, Brian, because to speak very candidly, you hear a lot about cahoots in articles and in the media. And RTI, they've done an initial scan of literature and a scan of practice dating back to the 60s. And there are other options for us to consider. So we really want to look at our data and see what's going to have the biggest impact in Durham, and then what aligns with our leadership, being both the administration and our city council's goals. So we don't want to do a prepackaged program if our data is showing that that's not really the biggest bang for your buck or your biggest community need. So that's why it was really important for us to start with what our data are telling us, which is why the pilots that Durham implements might be different than the pilots that Raleigh implements. Everyone is really looking at their data, talking to their leadership to see, here's our data. Now, what about our data are you trying to change? What outcomes would you like to see? What numbers would you like to see different? And that's how we're going to select the pilot. And as Brian alluded to, the resources, what things do we have control over given state law, given our own local resources, and really try to piece together what pilot makes the most sense. But Beverly, Judith did have her hand, his or her.
Okay. For some reason, I am not seeing it, but if the person who needs to ask the next question will turn on the camera, that would be great.
I've unmuted Judith. She should be able to speak.
I'm
Hi,
sorry.
it says my video has been stopped. There we go. Hi, this is Judith with CBS 17. I was curious if there was any incident or anything that happened, anything wrong with the way calls are being handled now that prompted this, and also curious about how much this is costing the city.
All great questions. So I will say that it's not that something went wrong. I think as we saw over the summer, we've heard across the entire country, people just wanting their governments to look to see, are we handling these calls the best way to meet community needs? So the cost for this study, this is actually a great story that we haven't even highlighted, is that the city of Durham contracted with RTI for $25,000 using some grant funds that we previously had from Bloomberg. I get from the Office of Innovation, of where we really try to pilot and innovative practices. So we use some of those funds. And then we had a national philanthropic organization learn about this data-based approach to looking at this problem or this opportunity. And they have contributed to this study so that I think we're free to say the amount at this point, right, Brian? Almost to the tune of $900,000 from Arnold Ventures, who will fund this. So now we have access to experts at RTI, the University of Chicago, which also has international experts on this topic. And it's not going to cost the cities any additional funds to have access to the experts. So.
Yeah, and I would just like to point out, thank you so much, Monica. So RTI being a nonprofit, basically we need support for our time so we can lend our expertise to these important topics. So Arnold Ventures was able to provide that support. And so there is a team of researchers and analysts at RTI that are working on this. I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize all the hard work that they've already put into this. But it's an interdisciplinary group of a lot of different experts, both within RTI and with the University of Chicago Health Lab, who is a partner of ours on this. I'd like to highlight the work of a few folks specifically. So the Center for Policing Research and Investigative Science, Dr. Kevin Strong, is one of the principal investigators on this from RTI. The other principal investigator is Dr. Renee Mitchell, who's with RTI. And then Dr. Rebecca Neustetter and Dr. Harold Pollack with the University of Chicago Health Lab are rounding out a team of experts that are really lending decades of experience of analyzing these data and potential responses, and then having the capacity to rapidly evaluate. We're thrilled with the way that this has worked out, and that the public in these cities are getting world-class expertise without cost to taxpayers.
And I have another follow-up question to that. Is this going to be looking at any ways at what's happening at the dispatch center, or is this just the police officers on the ground outside?
Great question, Judith. I don't know if we need to recruit Judith to the team, but yes, all of it's on the table. I've sometimes used the term life cycle of really trying to look at the call, the nature from the beginning to what's the outcome. So yes, we're looking at all of those aspects of the process. So.
Yeah, I'll echo what you were saying, Monica. I think Judith, I don't know if you've been reading our emails, but yes, you're right on the money with that. And so the University of Chicago specifically, their focus is on the dispatch side of that, because that is a integral part of this process. And understanding how information goes into the 911 system is just as important as understanding the outcomes out in the field.
Okay, thank you. We have Maggie Brown, WRL. Could you turn on your camera, please? She wanted to know more about directed patrolling, and could you better explain what that is?
Sure. So a directed patrol is something that's called out by an officer. So this is proactive activity. So there's two ways that there is information that goes into the 911 system. One is when someone in the public calls 911 and requests law enforcement response or fire or EMS, depending on what their issue is. The other is that officers elect to do a certain activity. And that could be a traffic stop, that could be stopping their car, getting out and knocking on a door. Or in this specific case of directed patrol, it is doing a focused patrol within a given geographic area at a specific time. So the decision to make those directed patrols can come from a variety of sources. One source is that based on the officer's experience and their work in that area, they elect to do a directed patrol on their own based on their experience, and they would call that out to the 911 system. Another way that that can happen is through informal requests from the public that don't go through 911. That could be an email from someone in the public to their city council member that says, I'm having a certain type of issue at a certain time. So then the command staff for that given district would then instruct their officers that at this time in this location, we would like an officer to go through and check maybe there's specific suspicious activity, or maybe there's been an issue with larceny for motor vehicles at a certain time. Officers would go in at those times to try to be highly visible. And the idea is that they're either deterring crime or increasing citizen perception of safety. Another way that directed patrols are allocated is through the crime analysis unit. So many of these cities, and Durham specifically, as analysts that analyze the call for service and crime data to understand concentrations of crime, both spatially and geographically. And then officers will respond at those times. And again, the idea there is either to deter crime or increase resident perception of public safety. And let me know if that clears it up. I know that a lot of these things are pretty jargon heavy. So if I'm not speaking in a way that's accessible, please let me know.
Mm-hmm. Judith, I'm sorry, Maggie, did you have a follow-up question that you wanted to put in chat? I don't know if your camera is accessible.
I think I got Mike. No, that helps. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Judith, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, I'm just curious. I know some of Durham's 911 calls, those calls are being redirected to the Raleigh 911 dispatchers. Does this have any impact on that system right now? I know that was having some impacts because of COVID-19. I don't know if this study was involved with that at all.
So in terms of a caller that is requesting public safety services outside of the jurisdiction being rerouted to another call center?
I mean, people in the jurisdictions, calls being rerouted to another call center. I think Raleigh was handling some calls earlier in this month because of COVID-19 and some staffing issues. I just didn't know if this study was going to take that into account at all.
So we can see in the computer-aided dispatch data if a call is referred to another agency. It hasn't been the primary focus of this analysis. It is something that's reflected in the data. I will just say that there is something called mutual aid, and that is within a certain jurisdictional overlap. I think typically it's within 1 mile. Depending on capacity, there is the possibility in North Carolina for a responder outside of a jurisdiction to respond in that. So the example you have there of someone in Raleigh responding within Durham city limits, I think that's something that occurs pretty infrequently, and but it is an important consideration if there were any interventions that were going to be deployed and, near the edge of a jurisdiction. That's something that we'd have to deconflict both operationally and for the evaluation to make sure that we're taking that into account. So very, very good question. You know your stuff.
And just to add some context for everyone, the data cover October 29th of 2017 through October 29th of 2020. So all of the numbers that you saw are from that time period, October 2017 to October 2020.
Okay, so Liz Slamer had a follow-up question. She wanted to know if you know how Durham's data compare to the other cities in the study. This presentation was for only Durham, correct?
Correct. This is Durham's data only. So I don't know the time frame for the other cities. We're not that we're competitive or anything, but I do think we are a bit ahead of the other cities as it comes to having our questions answered internally, sharing it with council. But I'll let Brian, who's involved with all of the other cities, talk a bit about where the other cities are.
Yeah, thanks so much, Monica. So good question, Liz. And so I think there's going to be some important findings that we can understand by looking across the cohort collectively to see trends that are happening at a macro level. So Durham has a publicly available long report that has all the information that was presented today, some additional tables, and also framing context for how the analysis was done. This analysis has been replicated with the other 6 cohort cities, and the public reports for that are pending. There are some, as Monica mentioned, Durham is leading the group here. There are some considerations that we're making with the analysis and the data for the other cohort cities that we're finalizing. So we're hoping to have those reports finalized soon, early 2021, and that will facilitate the comparison across the cohort cities. The one word of caution that I'll put here is that there are minor differences in the way the data are structured and the databases are housed for each 911 system. So while you can make some generalizable observations across the cohort cities, there might be a few little asterisks on it in terms of saying, you know, the data here is a little different, or in Raleigh, they do things a little bit differently. But we'll have the framing and the context of that for those longer public reports. But it's a great question, because I think a lot of these things, we're going to want to understand how this is happening in North Carolina. But with the movement towards open data and law enforcement now, a lot of these data are publicly available. So we can make comparisons not only across North Carolina, but across some of the largest agencies in the United States that make their call for service data openly available.
Do you have
just two things I want, because Brian keeps referencing the publicly available report. It's going to be part of the agenda packet. I don't know if that's gone live, but as soon as we publish all of our agenda, like we do for every meeting, the long report will be there, as well as the presentation that we will cover, which you all have seen most of his slides for next week. But sorry, Liz, you're going to say something else.
Oh, I wanted to ask, are there any general observations you can make at this time, either about the group as a whole with all the cities, you know, trends that are common, or anything that stands out, or is it too early to ask that?
I would venture at our last team meeting, because we meet pretty regularly as a cohort. It was still early, but the excitement is what's really high, even among all of our managers. I see our interim manager page is on here, of really just being methodical about how we're approaching potential alternatives of looking at our data. I know some of the cities had some follow-up questions with their data, so they're not as far along as we are, but we're looking forward to the benchmarking, particularly looking at pilots. At some point, we might see that there's certain laws or regulations that might prevent certain pilots. So being able to see how prevalent or how much interest there is across the state is going to be interesting. So benchmarking is going to be a very important aspect of this work.
And
And Monica, if I can ask one more thing, you mentioned cahoots earlier. I've heard of that before, but for someone who is not familiar with it, can you explain what that alternative looks like?
Yeah, I'm going to actually let Brian do it because I know he's a lot closer to it, but very celebrated program.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Monica. It's something that's Cahoots is getting a tremendous amount of attention, and let me get to that in a moment. The one thing that I wanted to piggyback on Monica's comment, I think for the findings for the folks in this initial set of analysis is really dependent on what your orientation towards the data was to begin with. Internally at RTI, we've been working with these data for a decade. So our expectations are probably different than some folks that are seeing these analyses for the first time and may not really have had a preconceived notion of what law enforcement is actually doing. So I think that's what's so critical about this foundational step is just setting this common picture of saying, we can't rely on anecdote and we can't rely on, perspectives that have been shaped by personal experiences. Those things are important, yes, but we have to have the data drive the discussion of what are police doing, what are the demands from the community, and what do we want this to look like in the future. And so for Cahoots, my short answer is that The Atlantic just within the past few days did a fantastic overview of the Cahoots program and what it is. So I strongly recommend checking out that article. You should be able to find it online. It's wonderful. But the little bit longer answer is Cahoots is an alternative response. This was started in Eugene, Oregon. And the idea is specifically for individuals in crisis or members of vulnerable populations. So that's folks dealing with mental health issues or housing instability. Instead of a law enforcement response, there are responders that go out and they're called Cahoots. And they go out and respond to these individuals. Some of these things are non-criminal in nature. They're civil or they're just a person in distress. So it's not necessarily a law enforcement response. And the idea is that these people are trying to identify what the needs of this person are and then matching them to the resources in the community. So this is emphasized in the article in The Atlantic, and one of the co-PIs, Dr. Renee Mitchell, is doing extensive research into all of these alternative responses to understand what really goes into them and if there's an evidence base in the scientific literature to demonstrate their efficacy. So one thing that I'll note about that is there are a tremendous amount of resources available in Eugene, Oregon for folks to be matched with. That may or may not be the case in the cities in the cohort. So that's an important consideration when evaluating these potential responses. And secondly, the Cahoots model is it's supported by Whitebird Clinic, which is a very large public health entity. And they have a tremendous amount of resources, and they've been doing this. The history of this goes back decades. So I say all of that to caution, this is not something that you can just pick up in a box and say, we're going to implement Cahoots, and then magically these jurisdictions have this. That's something that was developed over quite a bit of time. It is a really exciting program. There are some evaluations of it. And so it's something that we'll certainly consider for the alternative responses. I just want to make sure that everyone has, reasonable expectations for what that program is and what it takes to implement. So Monica, I'm sorry if that's much more detailed than you were looking for, but that's my overview.
Okay.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Monica.
No, I was going to say great. I think the longer explanation was great to give Liz some more context for it.
Okay. If anyone else has a question, go ahead and turn your camera on and state who you are and ask your question.
Me
Okay.
again. Just wondering what the timeline for this was going to be, when we can expect phase 2 to start and the whole thing to wrap up.
Great question. So this is something we've been very vocal to RTI about, that it's research meets practitioner, that real life is happening every day. So we can't, it's not an academic assignment. But our next milestone step, Judith, is to have a conversation with our city council, possibly at the budget retreat, about what are their goals. So next Thursday, we're going to share this data. see if there's any interest in additional information. Like Brian said, staff were already interested in use of force, wanting to know like which calls might have more frequent use of force and things. So that then at the retreat, we can have conversations and really start understanding what are council's goals. Dr. Mitchell from RTI will present on research of alternatives. So really spend that time to piece together a pilot that makes sense for us, a pilot that we have the resources. So our goal is sooner than later to have a pilot up. I'm not going to put out a date or a month, but we are very sensitive to the fact that this is not an academic exercise. And we want to try things. That's why it's a pilot, and have rapid evaluation. So emphasis on implementation. So next Thursday is a milestone. The budget retreat is a milestone of being able to talk to our city council and the administration about what are they looking for from a pilot. And then we will go off and put that pilot together and then get that started.
Okay, thank you, Judith. We now have Ashad with the News and Observer.
Hi, I wanted to ask about some of the qualitative information that you're looking to get to go with the data.
Yeah, that's great.
What are some of those things that you're looking at?
Yeah, so bringing in stakeholders. So RTI held some focus group with our police officers. As we've told Chief Davis time and time again, they are very much important stakeholders, or having their voice be part of this is very important. So RTI, they're still shifting through some of those insights that they held, several focus groups that were just really thoughtfully done, of putting officers in like ranks so that folks felt free to speak. We know that it's a paramilitary organization, so making sure that people were in spaces where they felt like they could speak their mind. Staff did not attend. It was RTI and our officers only. Getting our voice of council, and then learning from city council if there are any other voices that they think are important to include in this process. So it's really the voices of stakeholders that we consider to be an important data point, just like the quantitative data.
Okay, I think it's a great point. And I just want to say that, you know, at RTI, we have experts on the quantitative side that are conducting the analysis of the call for service data. We have experts on the qualitative side as well. And so the idea behind the focus groups is we are taking copious notes, almost like a courtroom reporter or stenographer would. So we have nearly word for word a transcript of what is being discussed in these focus groups. We then examine that using a software that pulls out key themes and codes. And that's what we're going to be able to summarize and provide back. So that provides the context of the officers in the field that are responding to these calls about their experiences in the system, and some reflections on the initial analysis that we did. So we're excited to have that perspective. And we think it's, you know, it's critical to provide that context. And the focus groups were conducted with officers, so the patrol officers that are actually responding to calls. Then one focus group focused on first line supervisors. So that's one rank higher than a patrol officer that is directing their day-to-day activity.
So it's kind of how they feel about the data, and what that data, what each call, what it's like dealing with those calls in person. That's kind of what the focus groups are
And if
about.
I'm not mistaken, Brian, you all did venture and ask them questions about any ideas they had on alternatives as well. So it wasn't just constricted to the data. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't mind being corrected in front of group.
No, that's right. It's really understanding, getting a sense of the patrol officer's perception of their job, what resources they currently have available, what things that they think would help them do their job better or differently. Those are the types of questions that we were asking.
All right. And do you have any results from the quantitative analysis so far?
We don't. So we have all of the notes have been taken. So we have all of that information. The qualitative analysts are working through that now. And the idea is that we'll have high level findings prior to Thursday's meeting next week. I will just note the calendar. Many of our staff are off this week, so we expect to have more information to share next week.
All right. Thank you.
And the client, we expect that too. So I would say stay tuned on Thursday.
That's right.
So we're going to take maybe 2 more questions in the interest of time. If you have a question, please put your name in chat and Viv will turn your camera on. Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay, so I don't see any other questions, and Monica and Brian, you see one? Oh, Judith Rincon. Judith? See if we
So
can.
I guess one last thing, I guess if you could both sum up what you hope to get out of this study, at the end, what would it be?
Yeah, so I'm a lifelonger public administrator and an evaluation background in strategic planning. So I'm addicted, and a millennial. So I'm addicted to believing there's always a better way to do something. It's in my DNA. So really just being able to say, is there a different way to do something? Is it better? Because just because it's different doesn't mean that it's better. But when we compile administration, police, community, when we compile all of those voices into a mixer, are there opportunities to ensure that everyone believes that we're doing something the best way? So that's really I don't think I have one particular thing, Judith. I'm a researcher at heart too, so just the process of being methodical and analytical about this exploration to me is already a win. But I think if the voices that have really requested this feel as though we've been thorough and analytical and fair in this approach, that's really what I want from it. But Brian.
Yeah, I think, and so I echo Monica's sentiment that we need to get this right, and we have to really, we can't assume that the way that we're currently doing things is necessarily the best way. So the main goal for me out of this is, the first one obviously is we want to be able to better align public safety resources with community need. That is the overarching thing. But the second thing is really, I think after this project's concluded and years from now, I hope that there's this sustained push to say, in law enforcement or public safety or any public service, instead of saying we do this because this is the way we've always done it, you can say we do this because this is what the evidence base says is most effective at meeting the needs of our community.
Okay. Any final comments, Brian or Monica?
I'm a geek that so many people thought that data, they came together in a holiday week to talk about data and to be interested in this. And I know it's because it's data that represents a service that's so important to communities across the country. So Beverly, I would just say thank you to everyone for having an interest in this and really encourage people to tune in next Thursday.
Okay, and it is live streamed, everybody. With that then, I guess we'll close it out. And if you have any follow-up questions, if you'd like to send them to me, I can forward them to Monica or Brian. And we'll end with that. All right, thank you, everybody.